Hello, and thank you for taking time to join us for this first of what we hope will be an ongoing series of discussions about the increasingly important issue of pets and housing. My name is Ross Barker, and I'm the program director for the Pet Inclusive Housing Initiative, which is a collaboration between Michelson Found Animals and the Human Animal Bond Research Institute. Our work focuses on removing systemic barriers to pet ownership and rental housing by shaping policy, influencing industry practices, and equipping stakeholders with important resources and data. And for this conversation, why pets belong in housing policy, we are very happy to welcome three leaders in the area of pets and housing. We have with us Susan Riggs, a Senior Director of Housing Policy for ASPCA's Government Relations team. We have Jessica Simpson, who is a Senior Public Policy Specialist with Humane World for Animals. And we have Nia Bratton, Public Policy Manager at Michelson Center for Public Policy. So why don't we just quickly go around and just do a quick introduction of yourself, and we'll start with you, Susan.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I came to the ASPCA about 8 years ago after having spent about 2 decades in the affordable housing policy space. So, I came to the ASPCA specifically because of our experience in working with shelters and seeing that surrenders related to housing were going up. And I think they were specifically looking for someone with housing expertise and, you know, um, I, dove right in, and after a period of time, we actually created a pretty unique campaign around pets and housing and a dedicated position for focusing on the issues that are underlying all the surrenders related to housing.
That's great. Thanks, Susan. Jessica, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Sure.
So I began working with the Humane World for Animals, formerly the Humane Society of the United States, on this issue back in 2020. So prior to that work, we had a campaign that was targeted, I think, more towards housing providers and less from a legislation style of campaign. And our work sort of kicked off when the pandemic happened. That really put into sort of this sharp focus the importance of talking about pets in housing policy. At the time, there was, I think, an estimated 30 to 40 million renters that were at risk of eviction. And so we also were recognizing through our work with our Pets for Life campaign, which does some of this direct door-to-door outreach. And so we're hearing from those clients about the challenges they were facing, what that meant, those evictions could mean for pets. And so we wanted to make sure that we were part of the work that was keeping pets and people together in their homes.
Thank you. And Nia, tell us about yourself.
Of course. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Ross, team. Super happy to be on with Jess and Susan, great experts in the space, and honestly have learned a lot from them. I've been with Michelson for about 2 years now. Formerly was working for a county supervisor over in San Bernardino County, where I really got the chance to dive into people and the policies that would really help and change their lives. And one of those things was really understanding the homelessness dynamic in San Bernardino County and how a lot of those folks had pets and really trying to figure out how we can house them from, entry housing all the way to permanent housing. And so when I joined Michelson and got the chance to start working with Ross on this, it just really kind of picked up where I left off at the county. And so super happy to continue to explore this issue and find really creative solutions to this complex problem. So happy to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
Great. Thanks, Nia. Thanks, all of you. And so, you all come from slightly different perspectives on this with different backgrounds coming into it. And yet you're all at the same place trying to do some of the same things. So I'm curious, is there something about the moment right now that we're in that makes this sort of a turning point for thinking about pets and pet inclusive housing specifically? Is anything shifting in the landscape that you're seeing that makes this the right moment? Susan, let's start with you.
Yeah,
I can see you nodding your head.
I'll
So
definitely weigh in. I feel like there's a number of factors that are really lining up to make it, a really critical issue. I think, the cost of housing altogether has grown to a level that is really challenging pretty much all households. And, I think the strain on the housing market is really hitting renters much harder than homeowners by and large. And I think concurrent with that, we're seeing an increase in pet ownership altogether, and especially among younger generations. And the kind of traditional household formation patterns of, kind of getting married, moving in together, getting married, having children has really been disrupted. And I think in part because of the cost of living and the cost of housing specifically. And so folks, instead of, taking that path, they're choosing to have, a dog or a cat in their household instead. And, we're really seeing that impact on, the economy and the need for pet inclusive housing. And so I think, those two critical factors or three critical factors, the cost of housing going up, the number of renters going up, and, a higher demand for having pets in the household is really kind of, coming together to make this a really critical issue that policymakers need to pay attention to.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you say policymakers paying attention to this. 'Cause I think that's one of the things we see, right? Is in the midst of all the things that are happening right now in the political landscape, how do we get pets to be seen in that way? It's a serious policy issue, or part of a serious policy issue. And Jess, what are you and your colleagues at the HWA seeing on this front?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that Susan just said, absolutely. Housing instability is at historic levels, and as a part of that, we're seeing higher relinquishments to shelters, a lot of what Susan had mentioned initially. And then additionally, the cost of veterinary care is increasing. So people are having all these competing challenges that they have to face as a part of pet ownership, and then losing their home is a big component to that. I think also we're seeing which has been interesting, a real shift in the recognition of how important the pet is to the family from housing providers. And so while the market seems to be opening up in some sectors to more pet-friendly housing, we're also seeing those policies implemented in a variety of different ways. So while pet-friendly may mean accessible to some families, it definitely has barriers that limit access for others. And so I think that's been sort of a shift. So having to contend with.
How about you, Nia? What are you all seeing?
Yeah, I think really most of what Susan and Jess have said, I think that's really the issue, and making sure too that housing is accessible to everyone, and that just doesn't mean like the cost. It's all about what you can bring in, and families should not have to make a choice between that, right? We don't make people make choices between their kids, so why are we making them make a choice between having a pet or not? And honestly, really having more inclusive housing will help everything else. It'll help the shelters with lower capacity, which means they can go ahead and reinvest in community, which would lower the cost of care. And so really just thinking about it like that, about how this all connects together is really crucial, really important, and something that we need to continue to talk to policymakers about and really change the stigma about pets and housing as well.
Susan, I want to ask you now. ASPCA has been a leader in connecting the dots between housing insecurity, pet relinquishment, among other organizations. But what do the data and real world outcomes tell us about our housing policy and how the lack of it really affects families with pets?
Well, I think, there's a real movement, I think, among, housers, social service providers, health advocates, et cetera, on this kind of one health model. And I think, central to that, of course, is stable housing. And, when you connect pets to that, I mean, ironically, as an affordable housing policy practitioner for many years, pets didn't even really enter into my thinking. And I think that's one of the experiences that I have when I speak to legislators. It's like light bulbs go off. And I think the same thing with, folks in other sectors, we tend to silo ourselves. And when we come together and have these conversations, the light bulbs do come on in terms of, the importance of pets. So if you're a mental health practitioner, you understand, the data behind the support that pets provide, the companionship, the importance to staving off loneliness at a time where we have, loneliness epidemic. So I think the all of the data is pointing to how integral pets are to every aspect of a household's life and how it behaves. And that can be as specific as an individual living on the street and they've had a pet with them while they've been on the street for security and for companionship, and they get an opportunity to come off the street and they don't want to. They don't want to leave that pet behind. So if they don't have an option to take that pet with them, they're going to refuse housing. And obviously, if your silo, if your business is, trying to provide safe, stable housing for folks that have been chronically homeless, that's a problem that you need to solve for. And, so that's a barrier that can be solved, but I think it's just really now rising to the top that, this is something that's easily solvable and we need to do that. And so, that's a very specific example, but I think beyond that, things like our mental health crisis in this country and, the strain that financial challenges that many households are experiencing right now, pets are really important to that to, help with stress and anxiety and, companionship and those types of things.
So you've all talked about the importance of pets in the family's lives, and I'm just wondering, but at the same time, it sounded like the policies that we're seeing from housing providers aren't matching that necessarily. So is there any place in particular, I mean, ask Jessica or any of you jump in. I mean, is there any place where you're seeing the human animal bond really, what we know about the human animal bond not being embraced by housing providers? Is that part of the challenge?
There's a lot of space for improvement for sure. I mean, the research that you all have done with Habri, you mentioned earlier, found that 95% of pet owners consider their pets as part of their family. And what we see in reality is that a lot of the policies that we see in rental housing ultimately harms both people and pets. And so I think the restrictions that are among the most problematic are the restrictions on breed, on weight, when we see really high non-refundable fees or deposits that can be prohibitive for a lot of families. We hear these continuously from our shelter partners in their conversations with clients who are needing to relinquish pets. And so I think while these policies, they might be well-intentioned, ultimately they do create barriers and undermine housing stability. So I think getting to sort of the crux of why they're in place and moving past the it's always been this way sort of mentality into examining where we can be flexible to make sure that housing providers feel comfortable with the policies, feel protected in, the policies that they have in place so that their residents are protected from any major concerns of safety and health, while also sort of navigating why they're there so that when they're a barrier for a lot of people, that they're removed.
I feel like we would be remiss to not mention, just how out of sync our market is in terms of supply and demand, and the ability of landlords to be very discerning about what populations they admit into their properties. And, I think pets in particular, it's such a dichotomy because we know that, a large percentage of renters in whatever municipality you're in are going to have pets. And yet, because there's this very constrained supply, we're seeing that, landlords, because of perceptions about damage and liability, are really limiting the pool of pet inclusive housing for those renters. And, that becomes highly detrimental. And so really, at the end of the day, I mean, the most effective tool that we would have is to increase supply. And obviously, that is something that takes a very long time. I know that, states and, and at the federal level, there are a lot of efforts right now to do that, for a variety of reasons. But I think that could go a long way towards, opening up options. And I think that the other thing that I would add that has been alluded to here is the greatest constraint on supply is really impacting the low income renters and communities of color, because that is where you see, this bottleneck of huge demand because the cost of housing is so high. Everybody's targeting the, kind of the lower levels. And because the demand is there, the availability of pet inclusive housing is almost non-existent. And so it really is at the higher level that most individuals cannot afford, where you see the pet inclusive amenities and pet inclusion that, doesn't include, a bunch of fees and barriers and, restrictions.
That's important. And that help us think through the policies that housing providers are making. So that's one side of it. And Nia, I'm curious, I mean, from the, the other policy work, and Susan's alluded to it also, is on the legislative side. So what are we, is there a barrier? Have you seen barriers to having this pet inclusive discussion with policymakers and having that be part of a overall broader housing discussion?
Yeah, there's a ton of barriers, and it's really just because they don't think about pets in that way, right? Then, we've met with tons of legislators over the course of the past 2 years, and they've really been like, yeah, I had a pet and I had so much struggle getting into a rental. And you're like, yeah, and you don't see the issue. And they're like, oh, and then the light bulb goes off. And I think really it's been the framework about how we've been talking about this is like a separate issue other than just being a human issue. We really have to continue to work to, like I said before, push past stigma and the sense of like that pets are this separate thing, and they're not. They're people's lives, right? People, you see so many people, right? The way they care for their pets, they got their pets in a purse, they're pampering them, and it's like this is their life, and they deserve easy access to housing with their pets. And I think really at Michelson, we have a really different approach. We've really taken a step back and really provided data to support the policy. I like to say educate and legislate at the same time, because if we have no data to push policy, then we're not going to get that same understanding. And it's really been nice to, like I said, work with Susan, work with Jess, provide them data. Really, Susan's done a lot of great work in Colorado, which I hope she touches on later. And Jess as well just passed like a bill in Maryland about pet transparency. And so I think with Michelson, we really have this unique convening approach where we can like help every state kind of figure out where you should start. And I think that's, we can't do it all at once, all the time, but sometimes it's simply being like, hey, let's make the policies more transparent so everyone's on the same playing field when it comes to trying to find a rental. Or, hey, yeah, so we're ready to get rid of some of our pet fees or put caps on them so that we can make renting more accessible to people. And that's the difference kind of in us. And I think where we play this really unique role. And that's why I love, working with Ross and working with the team, because we're able to do that. We're able to say, hey, here's the data, and here's how we can bring in other systems of education when we implement law. And that is very unique. And I don't think I've really seen that before. It's really been like, hey, let's just do this. What's the implementation look like? How's this going to affect landlords? But, we're able to really provide that data and say, like, here's how it's going to affect you. Here's like, you could be negative, positive outcomes, unintended consequences, but here's how you can implement it. We have all these resources, all these tools, and here's how maybe in a good budget year, we can provide you incentives for being a pet inclusive landlord. And so really thinking about it like that holistic way and really framing it again, it's just like a human issue. We just have to push past this, and we have to create a better understanding of people and where they're at now and really convene and connect people across sectors. That's really been the key in kind of pushing this conversation forward with legislators.
Yeah, and a couple of you have mentioned, and it several times come up, this light bulb moment when you talk to people, whether it's legislators or housing providers. I'm curious if you had, I mean, it makes me think, how are you getting to that light bulb moment? Is there something in particular you're talking about? I mean, you talked about latching on to this idea of legislator having had the problem before and having the dog in their purse. What are the things you can say to kind of get that light bulb moment happening with legislators?
Well, I mean, I think because there are so many connections between pet ownership and, quality of life in general, I think it's really easy to make the connections with particular legislators based upon what their background is. An example that I have is very early in working on this issue, I spoke to, a leader in the House in the state of Colorado, and she happened to be a survivor of domestic violence. And, I mentioned to her some of the work that we had done in California on the issue. And within a week, she had run language for, to address it in Colorado. And it was just a light bulb moment for her. She wasn't specifically impacted because of pets, but when I described what a lot of survivors of domestic violence go through in trying to protect their pets and keep their pets with them, the light bulb went off, and she just knew that that was something from a personal perspective that she needed to tackle immediately. And so we that year expanded the scope of what the protections were in the state of Colorado to make sure that pets were included as part of the family when you're considering trying to get a survivor to safety and out of a dangerous situation.
Jessica or Nia, do you have other thoughts about how to ignite that light bulb moment?
the work we've done through our Pets for Life and rural area veterinary services, it really helps us highlight the importance of this work, bringing sort of what I think what Nia was suggesting with or saying with how important data is, but then also incorporating that lived experience is really critical to moving the needle for a lot of folks. And so it's been really pivotal for us to incorporate those stories and make sure that we can bridge that gap between the data and the decision making.
Once you've sort of had that moment where you see people starting to come along, I mean, and then that opens up the opportunity for developing legislation. So I'd love to have y'all talk about what are some of the more promising policy interventions that you're seeing, either that have happened recently or that are upcoming or that you're hopeful for, and the impact you think those would have.
I'll point out the obvious, which is it's not a good time fiscally. So anything that has a fiscal impact right now is not kind of prime a prime target for legislative interventions. It's really about, taking a step back and, where can we intervene in markets to either incentivize ideally it's not the stick, it's the carrot, but sometimes you have to do a little bit of both. And we've really worked hard to try and do that. So for example, just I talk about Colorado again. We've had a series of two bills that have been pretty comprehensive, and we've tried to both address some of the rising costs around pet related rental costs, and at the same time alleviate some of the potential burden on property owners by providing them protections in insurance legislation that removes breed restrictions and that sort of thing. So, so we're really trying to think comprehensively about, how a package can fit together to provide both a carrot and stick without, a lot of cost to states that right now are really struggling to stay above water generally. In healthier budget times, I think we're going to have a lot of other options as well. But I think, for now, it's really about intervening in markets.
Yeah, I mean, I love the creativity that we've seen across the different states to tackle this issue from all sides. And I think for me personally, I've been really interested in learning a little bit more, having not come from the affordable housing background like Susan has. I've learned this is a very complicated space. And there's a ton of opportunities to get involved with organizations that are not maybe traditional allies of ours. And so supporting the work that they've been doing for decades to make sure that there is access to more stable and affordable housing. I think where we could get involved with those types of movements. So as animal advocates, being able to bring sort of that unique perspective to legislation that we don't traditionally put our fingers in. So bills that maybe target rent stabilization or have stronger funding for emergency rental assistance, anti-discrimination type protections with source of income stuff and things like that, where we have an opportunity to engage and support other movements that at their core, their mission aligns with ours, keeping people, and for us as a part of that, pets housed. So that's what I've been really excited about, seeing sort of the combination of work.
Yeah, I think really we're trying to strategize differently. This past legislative year, we tried to, with Susan and Jess, of course, put some sort of legislation about fees inside of like a housing bill. And that was really a different approach and I think a great approach. And so if we can start to think about how can we put some of these things in different kinds of bills, right? Some of the pet pieces so that because right, like that changes the stigma because pets again are part of the family. And so this again is a housing barrier, a human barrier, not just like a pet barrier. So we did that this year. It didn't work out, but hopefully, we can continue to strategize and think like that. We signed on, Michelson signed on to an affordable housing bill. And so just making sure that too, when they're building stock, right? That's the other thing when they're building, that they're making sure that they're thinking about people with pets in mind so that they don't have these barriers, that they don't create these barriers like that we have now. I think another thing too, we've been working on a really good feasibility study inside of Los Angeles, again, with Susan and Jess, which has been awesome, and kind of making sure that we are creative in that way, right? So looking at, can we add pets to the rent stabilization ordinance under just cause to make sure that they have the same rights as tenants and can only be evicted for things that are, you know, already in statute. So really just kind of thinking more creatively, more holistically, kind of at a farther lens about, as long as we're protecting like tenant rights, we also need to protect people with pets and their rights as well. So I think that's really the difference and the way we're trying to tackle it, since it's such a complex issue on its own, and it doesn't get the same kind of like, you know, it doesn't get the same breadth, the same vision as other just like tenant rights issues.
I think pretty much every state right now is grappling with how to increase affordability altogether, and they're all grappling with, all of these rental fees, additional rental costs. It feels like, post-COVID, there was just this disaggregation of rental structures, and I think it goes, to transparency. It goes to, rent, instability in the rental markets, that renters go out and they really just don't understand that they're going to be nickeled and dimed with all of these additional fees. And so, the transparency piece, and as Nia mentioned, connecting pets to this broader issue of, just, kind of putting fee on top of fee on top of fee, and the rental structure where renters are already struggling just to meet the base rent is really, really important to take that into consideration as one of the factors that really is impacting renters. But it's a very broad issue right now in terms of, disclosure of all of these fees and reining them in, and just, making them reasonable. We worked on an ordinance in Bellingham, Washington, just right up close to the border of Canada. And, they're a university town, and, the vast majority of folks there are renters. And, we got reports from, students that were paying for, package delivery fees, and, appliance usage fees, and, just all sorts of really absurd new fees that were coming out. And so the ordinance really exposed a lot of this kind of excessive, fee, unfair fee structures that were happening. And, the pet related fees being just a piece of that, but a significant one for those households that do have pets. And so, really kind of connecting it to that broader issue, and, helping policymakers to understand that the unintended consequences of all of these fees are really driving renters to make some very, very difficult choices.
It sounds like you are seeing opportunities to tie the pet related fees into those that broader bucket that we hear about as junk fees. Is that that seems like part of the approach, right? I mean, there's so many of them, and again, it's like all of the other issues you talked about. So how do you get them thought of in the same sense as these other things, the package pickup and the package delivery and the whatever other things. I know Jess has talked about having a grill in a property that, who's paying for this? Why are we paying for this? Does anybody get the grill, right? So I think there's all these things that you don't think you're paying for, but you end up paying for, and getting pets integrated into that equation is tricky, I think. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. But I'm curious, is the a lot of things we talked about, they cover people broadly. I mean, are you also though seeing these restrictions interacting with broader issues? We also talk a lot about whether it's racial, economic, or geographic inequality. Are you seeing housing restrictions related to pets impact in those areas as well?
I think so, absolutely. We've definitely seen housing policies reinforce existing inequities, and have found that when the rules are sort of left to discretion, or up to a landlord, it's our most vulnerable population. So low-income households, people of color, people without many options for rental housing, who are going to be most often impacted and are going to have to make those awful choices between keeping a pet or losing their home. One of the ways we've seen that is we've launched a mentorship program for the past few years, where we're working with shelters across the country to help them with housing policies and combat the pet relinquishment due to housing related issues in their communities. And through that, we've mapped a lot of housing related barriers across different cities, and consistently have found patterns of inequity. So those decades of the government sanctioned segregation and disinvestment have left a lot of communities with concentrated pockets of poverty and in those pet resource deserts. So things like groomers, veterinarians, pet supply shops are going to be in serious limited supply. And in a few locations, we've dug even deeper and have started mapping the shelter intake data. And those areas are also showing us that the regions with higher social vulnerability, so those are often going to be higher concentrations of poverty as well. Oftentimes also higher rates of renter versus owner populations. Pet surrenders that are tied to housing or financial hardship are most prevalent. So we're seeing the outcomes really reflect not just the individual housing struggles that people have, but also sort of this broader systemic inequity that has shaped a lot of the challenges and limited accessibility to pet inclusive affordable housing.
Jess really hit the nail right on the head. But I think, more anecdotal. I was looking at pictures at my parents' house the other day, and I saw my mom back when she was in college. She had a picture. She had a big pit bull, 100 pounds. I'm like, what happened? Right? Like, she was like, yeah, they didn't even ask. I just had the dog. They love the dog. And it's like, so what happened? What changed? And how can we get back to that where, doesn't matter what you look like, doesn't matter where you live, you are allowed to make that choice and have the animal that you want, and that you are just solely based on you as a pet owner and you as a person, and not just, not anything else, right? Not the way you look, not your gender, not the kind of dog you have. It's just all about you as a person. We need to go back to that, like, individual, judging people as like the individual and how they are versus the holistic view of what they look like and whatnot.
Kind of getting towards a wrap up here. I'm curious if you could ask whether it's policymakers, housing providers, the public, to change just one thing to support pet inclusive housing, who would you be asking and what would you be asking them?
I mean, pie in the sky.
Yeah, I mean,
I'd
yeah,
love
this is
for pets to be a protected class, having, I mean, just like children, because in earnest, I mean, it sounds like a silly idea, but in earnest, pets are many people's children. I mean, they mean as much to them as having a child would, but they've chosen not to have children. And so, the pet really does become the child. And, we're seeing, this dramatic effect of pets being kind of the lost member of the family because of the lack of the protections. So pie in the sky, that would be it. I think we're a long way from that though.
so just to dig on that a little bit, what's the first step? Who do we need to start to have that conversation with? How would you turn on the light bulb for that situation?
I think it starts with, the Fair Housing Act and, really strengthening that. Obviously, we're having a lot of turmoil in the country right now over the use of emotional support, animal reasonable accommodations. I mean, there's a lot of concern over falsification of those. A lot of states are really tightening up on the repercussions of falsifying that information or really limiting the ability for folks to request that accommodation. So we seem to be going backwards right now, but I really think it's it's a Fair Housing Act issue initially, and that would start at the federal government with HUD and the Department of Justice, and I think it's incumbent upon us to really demonstrate the importance of pets in the family. I mean, certainly we have the data that shows that the importance of pets and how people perceive them to be part of the family, but we really have to strengthen our talking points about the significance of that relationship and how it holistically contributes to a better quality of life for the households that those pets are living with.
Yeah, what about you? What's your one thing?
Oh, that's tough. That's tough. Susan kind of took my idea, so I think I'll try something else. I think really the ask would probably for me, second option would start at the state level to the governor and really working on what kind of department can we build that would house pet related housing issues to make sure that people who face these are getting help adequately in the right amount of time and to really ensure that we are pushing forward legislation. Like a lot of times when we push forward legislation, it doesn't, to me, it never goes through like the right kind of committee, because there's no committee that really sits on this really unique issue. And so to have that kind of department that would really be able to invest time in these issues, push policy forward, and give a kind of a different perspective, would I think be really great to states. And again, right, like every state's going to start at a different level, but to be able to have a level, I think is the most important thing.
Jessica, what would you say?
Well, I guess I'll talk to the advocates then. I think that what Susan said, that would be absolutely fantastic. And I do find it so interesting, the disconnect that seems to exist with some of like the biggest decision makers and advocates, because, or between the two, because people who have pets are like, oh, they're family members, but when it gets down to the nitty-gritty about making these kind of decisions, there's often a pause, and somehow we need to remind people that just because someone makes less money or is in a less powerful position, their pet doesn't mean any less to them. In fact, sometimes they can mean even more. But I think for the advocates, sort of what I was getting to earlier, lending your voice to sort of those cross-sector efforts to help prevent people from losing their homes, and by and large having to make decisions about relinquishing a pet, or all the other really awful decisions that people have to make when money is tight and they have to choose between basic necessities and other things that feel just as important to them. And I think we as animal advocates are quite a force to contend with. And it's been interesting in conversations with some tenant advocate groups and stuff. They've often said, like, maybe use your advocates, your voices, because there's so many, and pets are such a way to build bridges between people, that it might be more powerful coming from you than from the traditional housing allies. So I think that's kind of sad because it's such a important component to our society that housing doesn't always get the same voice in a lot of legislatures, depending on where you are. But yeah, I think just lending our voices to different sectors would be a great place to start.
Want to ask, because as we've gone through this, I note some great ideas that maybe haven't gotten been on full display yet. And I'm curious, you've all been doing this for a long time, right? So, I mean, in some capacity, you've been involved in this effort. And standing where you are now, are you optimistic about where things can go from here?
I guess I am of a mixed opinion
Okay.
on, I feel like the attention to the issue is growing. I think there's a recognition of the many ways that this impacts, different demographics, different types of households, but it feels like we have some challenges that are really impacting our ability to follow through. I think, the political discourse, of course, is very divided, and the partisanship that we see, at all levels of government now is extreme. So I don't think that helps us. At one point, most of my bills were completely nonpartisan, were getting unanimous votes, but I kind of feel like right now that is kind of in the rearview mirror, unfortunately. So I would say my view is a little bit mixed.
I'm optimistic, like Susan said, that the issue is getting more attention. I think that with younger generations, also, I think what was mentioned earlier, being more inclined to bring pets into the family, and as older generations retire, maybe we'll see sort of a change. I do think we're playing the long game here, though. I don't think that this is a problem that'll be fixed in the next few years by any long shot, but I am encouraged by the dedication of a lot of really young people to getting involved and making their voices heard.
Yeah.
Speaking of really young people, how about you, Nia? So
I was gonna say, yeah, I think my generation is gonna be the generation that really makes that systems change, just because the way we view pets, and a lot of us are opting to have pets as kids rather than have kids themselves. So yeah, I think we're gonna do it. It's just gonna take a lot more time, and again, we're just gonna continue to get educated and really push. and really be able to speak to these legislators and say like, hey, like if you don't fix this issue, then come the next election, we'll see what happens. And so I think that's really the key difference. We're really hardcore on that advocacy front.
That's great. I think that's a good place to wrap up. So the last thing I want to do is just ask you where people watching and listening can go to learn more about the work you're doing and how to get involved and support what you're doing.
Yeah, Michelson Center for Public Policy.org and petsandhousing.org.
For me, we're at the humaneworld.org. You can, I think, put in the search bar there to find your state director so you can engage locally. We're in, I want to say 37 states. And so that's a great place to learn more about the work we're doing broadly and connect with somebody on the ground.
And for the ASPCA, you can go to aspca.org/advocacy and sign up for our advocacy brigade, and we'll get notices out to you for your particular state or locality when we're contemplating action in your area. And just in general, you can go to aspca.org/housing to read up more on a little bit deeper on some of these issues.
Thank you so much to all of you. I really appreciate you being first in for one of these conversations, and just the expertise and the experience you bring to it. I really appreciate it, and all the work you're doing. So thank you, and we look forward to continue to work with y'all.
Thank you, Ross.
All right. Take care.